Marlon Humphrey's time in Baltimore might be running out, and if the front office is being honest with itself, that clock should already be hitting zero. There's a growing push from people who actually understand how this roster is built for the Ravens to trade their longtime cornerback right now, before this window closes for good. And once you hear the full reasoning, it's hard to argue against it. But here's the part that's going to sting a little. This isn't some random take from an outside voice with no connection to the building. This is coming from people who understand contracts, cap space, and exactly how General Manager Eric DeCosta operates under pressure. So the real question isn't whether Humphrey eventually gets moved. It's whether this front office is actually willing to pull the trigger before the value disappears completely. Here's the thing that makes this trade talk make so much sense right now. The Ravens are sitting on a glut of cornerbacks, and a few of the younger guys in that room have real upside at a fraction of the cost, with years of team control still ahead of them. Some of those bodies fit perfectly in the slot, which happens to be exactly where Humphrey's game has been trending anyway as he's gotten older. So the logic writes itself. If Baltimore has cheaper, younger options who could do a version of what Humphrey does, and do it on a rookie contract, why is the most expensive corner on the roster still holding down a starting job that isn't guaranteed to be his best fit anymore? It's not a knock on the player as a person. It's just roster math, and right now the math doesn't favor him. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because this front office has a real pattern here. DeCosta gets sentimental with certain players, and he's been willing to overpay guys well past their prime because of loyalty and name value. You saw it with Odell Beckham. You saw it with Justin Houston. You saw it with Kyle Van Noy. Mark Andrews is sitting in that exact same danger zone right now with his own contract situation. That pattern has to change, and it has to change starting with Humphrey. The Ravens already ate $4 million on his roster bonus this year. He's an older corner with a real injury history, and he's coming off a season most fans would rather forget. Add in the fact that new coordinator Jesse Minter has built a career finding long, rangy boundary corners for cheap, and you start to see why holding on to this contract doesn't line up with where this defense is actually headed. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where things get serious for Baltimore. The Ravens are already $355 million deep into payroll commitments. They've got an aging roster in several key spots, and their quarterback is only truly locked in for one more season under his current deal. When you're staring down a window that tight, every single dollar has to be spent with purpose. That's exactly why eating extra money on a trade actually makes sense here. If Baltimore has to attach a little extra cash to move Humphrey, that's not a loss. That's the cost of clearing a big number off the books while still getting something back in return, instead of just cutting him outright and getting nothing at all. This is where longtime NFL personnel executive Pat Kerwin comes into the picture, and his read on this is worth paying attention to. Kerwin spent years negotiating contracts and running a cap sheet, and his take is that Baltimore should be marketing Humphrey aggressively, way more than the usual bubble corners that most fans assume will be the actual trade bait on this roster. That's a different way of looking at this than most fans probably expected, and it flips the entire conversation. Instead of shopping the depth pieces nobody really wants, Kerwin is saying the best return sits with a name everyone assumed was untouchable. And according to him, there's already a specific plan for how that conversation should go inside the building. Kerwin's plan is simple on paper, but takes real conviction to execute. He said he'd walk straight into a meeting with owner Steve Bisciotti and lay out exactly why absorbing more of Humphrey's contract is the smarter long-term play for this franchise, even if it stings in the short term. That's not a small ask. That's asking ownership to take on extra financial pain to get a deal across the finish line. The market logic behind it makes sense once you break it down. Kerwin pointed out that Baltimore could package one or two of their other corners to a team that just lost its top cornerback and still has the cap room to absorb a bigger contract like Humphrey's or even Chidobe Awuzie. Teams in that spot, sitting right on the edge of contention with a hole at a premium position, tend to get aggressive fast. And Kerwin's exact framing stuck with me. He basically said, think about how many times you've watched a team trade a player away and eat half his salary just to get the move done. That happens more often than people realize. And it's usually the difference between actually improving your roster and just sitting on dead money hoping things magically get better on their own. I'll be honest, I agree with him completely here. Humphrey is currently the 10th highest paid cornerback in the entire NFL, and letting that number sit on the bench because of scheme fit or performance concerns isn't something I'm comfortable watching play out. But money and scheme fit are only half of this story, because there's another layer to this that makes the whole situation even more complicated. Let's get into what Baltimore could actually get back, because this isn't just about clearing money off the books. There's real talk about landing a pass catcher with some upside along with a late round pick in return, which would directly address a different need on this roster. There's also the addition by subtraction angle, where a younger corner like Keon Martin steps fully into that slot role from week 1 under Minter's system. But here's where things start feeling personal instead of just financial. Humphrey himself brought up comments this summer about Minter referring to some of his play as trash, and by most accounts, Humphrey didn't sound like he was joking around when he said it. When a player is publicly referencing his own coordinator questioning his effort or execution, that's usually a sign the relationship has already started to crack behind the scenes. That tension lines up with what the numbers were already telling us. Among qualified cornerbacks last season, Humphrey graded 70 or worse in far too many key metrics, and quarterbacks around the league simply stopped fearing throwing at him. Even in a scheme that's supposed to be corner-friendly under Minter, that stat line makes it even harder to justify leaning on an older, more expensive veteran over younger players with more upside and less mileage. So you end up with a contract that feels like it's headed one of two directions. Either Baltimore cuts him outright at some point, or they find him afresh, start somewhere else before that decision gets made for them. And once you start thinking about it that way, the cap-saving side of this becomes just as important as everything else on the table. This is where the trade deadline math really comes into focus. Even if Baltimore only saves $8 million in cash by moving Humphrey, that's real money that could be reinvested into another position group before the mid-season trade deadline hits. In a league where opportunities to upgrade your roster on the fly are rare, that kind of flexibility matters a lot more than people give it credit for. Compare that to the alternative, because the alternative isn't pretty. Trying to trade a team's 7th or 8th cornerback for anything of value almost never works. And if Baltimore waits too long, they risk losing Humphrey for nothing on waivers instead. The smarter path is fully incentivizing another team right now to bet on Humphrey returning to form, even if that means eating close to $10 million total to make the deal attractive. When you put all of that together, this becomes a real test of who this front office actually is. DaCosta has a track record of holding on to sentimental favorites past the point where it made sense, and this Humphrey decision is shaping up to be the clearest example yet of whether that pattern is finally going to change. Because if Baltimore gets this one right, it sends a message about how they'll handle every other tough veteran decision coming down the road, including Mark Andrews down the line. So let's bring this all together. The Ravens have real depth at cornerback, a defensive coordinator who thrives on cheap, rangy corners, and a payroll situation that's getting tighter by the year. Marlon Humphrey, for all he's meant to this franchise, has become the clearest example of a contract that no longer matches where this roster is headed. What makes this bigger than just one player is what it represents for Eric DaCosta and this front office going forward. This isn't only about Humphrey's snaps or his cap number. It's about whether Baltimore is finally ready to make the hard, unsentimental call at the right time instead of a year or two too late, the same way they've struggled to do with other veterans before him. So I want to know where you land on this one. Do you think the Ravens should actually pull the trigger and trade Marlon Humphrey before the season gets going? Or is this front office going to hold on too long like it has before? Let me know what you think in the comments. I want to hear your take on this one.
And if you're a true Ravens fan and love keeping up with everything happening around the team, don't leave this video without sharing it with a friend who's just as passionate. They're definitely going to enjoy this. See those videos on your screen right now? I picked the first one especially for you, and the other is recommended by YouTube. Go check them out, and I'll see you in the next video.